To kick off our day, we have Cara Martin, who's come with us all the way from Sydney, Australia, where she mentors women entrepreneurs through the Seeds Initiative. She's a lecturer at Mary Andrews College, has served as Associate Dean of the Marketplace Institute at Ridley College in Melbourne. She has extensive experience across media and communications, human resources, business, and analysis and policy development in a variety of organizations and as a consultant. She served as the director of the School of Christian Studies and has lectured at the Brisbane School of Theology, Macquarie Christian Studies Institute, and the Wesley Institute. So her career spans a lot of different categories, which is amazing. Margaret and I have enjoyed getting to know Cara over the last couple of days since she's been in Los Angeles, switching to this time of the world, and slept 11 hours yesterday. I can't remember the last time I slept 11 hours. And you probably won't learn how to do a Tim Tam slam from her, but we did, and it's amazing. So if you catch her offline, that would be fun. But you will be really blessed by Cara's wisdom, her biblical insights, and her life experience. So I want to welcome Cara Martin to the stage.
Well, hello. Actually, I should say, g'day. That's what everyone expects us Aussies to say. It's a delight to be here. When I was in Denver last year, they told me it wouldn't matter what I said. The Australian accent would just mean that you would listen to me. So that's awesome. When I was in Seattle a couple of years ago, I convinced everyone that koala bears, those cute fluffy things, they actually drop from trees and they're like vampires and they sink their teeth into your neck. But you guys are not so gullible, so I won't get away with that this time. What I'm going to be talking about is your work is worship. And my assignment this morning is to actually go through the entire Bible, a biblical theology of work, and from Genesis to Revelation in approximately 20 minutes. So let's see how we go. But I wanted to start with this question. What do you think of? What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say the word work? What is the first word that comes to mind? Okay, you've got it in your head. I just want a show of hands. For how many people was that a positive word that came instantly to mind? Excellent. The entrepreneur coach said yes. Okay, for whom was it a negative word that initially came to mind? Excellent. Thanks. You're honest Christians, and I love that. That's actually really significant because most of the words that we have as synonyms for work are actually negative words. I don't know if you've thought about that. So toil, labour, drudgery. In Australia, we say hard yakka. These are all negative connotations, negative ideas. And that's because our whole theology and understanding of work, both within churches and actually our understanding of work outside church, comes from basically the influence of the fall. What we're going to do today is actually go back and start at the beginning. We're going to start at creation, because in creation, work is good. And that's the way that work was. The fall, where we often start, is understanding that the process of working is cursed. And that's sort of the time that we live in now. We'll talk briefly about redemption, that workplaces can be redeemed. Work can be redeemed. Working relationships can be redeemed. And that's the way work could be. And we live into that possibility as Christians. And we'll talk also about restoration. There will be work in the new creation. This is probably the most depressing part of this morning. I tell you that when you die and go to heaven, there will be work. Some people get very upset about that, but I think it's going to be amazing work. It's going to be the best work. It's going to be incredible. It's the way work will be. And when I talk about work, I don't want you to think only of paid work. That's another thing that instantly comes to our mind, isn't it? We think of our paid work. I want you to think of work as much broader than that. My understanding of work is it's anything we do with intent and purpose. And so that includes our creative work, it includes housework, it includes the caring work we do, whether as parents or even caring for our parents or maybe a friend. It includes our side hustles and that sort of stuff. All of that is work in the eyes of God. So we need a broader understanding of what work is as we consider these things. So let's launch in. We'll start off with work is good. This is the way work was. If we have more time, I will get you to read the whole of Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. But feel free to sort of go there and really look at that and test what I say. But I'm just going to take you on a bit of a whiz through that. So at the beginning in Genesis 1, we see that God works. We don't often think about it like that. We think of creation, God creates, but we don't think of him actually at work, probably because we have those negative ideas about what work is. But there is God, and he's creating the world, and he's creating a beautiful place. And for that place, he is putting human beings into that place. God works, and we're made in the image of a God who works. Therefore, what that means is that work is intrinsic to who we are as human beings. It's not just having extrinsic value, the fruit of our work, but actually what it is to be a human being is to work. So one of the cruelest things that you can do to someone is deny them the ability to work or the capacity to work. To be fully human, we actually need to work because we're made in the image of a worker. And the very first thing that God asks humans to do is to work. In many ways, we were created to work. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, God has made this beautiful creation, and he says there is no one to work the earth. And so therefore he creates human beings. We were created to work. That's an amazing concept. And in 2:15 it says, he took the human being, put him in the garden to work the earth and to keep the garden. And the important thing about the Hebrew roots of the verbs in that verse, to work the earth and to keep the garden, avad and shema, is that they are the same Hebrew root verbs that are used later to talk about the work of the priests in the temple. So the priests in the temple are to serve God or worship God, avad, and they are to keep the commandments or keep the boundaries of the law, shema. So we have this linguistic linking between work and worship that is there right at the beginning and should continue to be so. Work and worship go together. The other thing that's amazing in this beginning story about work is that God chooses to work with us. He wants to work with us. There's a story in Genesis 2 of God there, and he brings the animals before the human being. And I think sometimes we sort of cross over that story, like we just flash through it because we want to get to the part where the animals are not good enough, and so God creates the woman to be with the man. That sort of feels like the main point of the story. But I wonder if you've considered how significant it is that God asked the human being to name the animals. Can you imagine? It's just such a beautiful snapshot of God saying, right, here is an animal. What are you going to call it? And the human being says, elephant. Or probably something in Hebrew, but anyway. So I just love that idea of us working in beautiful harmony with God. It's just a gorgeous vignette. And just as working the earth is sort of physical work, this is knowledge work. This is the sort of work that many of us do, trying to come up with stuff in our heads and think of things and working with God in that. And so what have we learnt? We've learnt that work is good, that God works, that we are made in the image of a God who works, so it's intrinsic to who we are. We've learnt that we were created to work. We are meant to work with God. And we act in some ways as vice regents in the creation mandate or the cultural mandate, as it's often called in Genesis 1:26-28, God actually gives us responsibility to be his stewards over his creation. And how do we do that? We do that through our work, our ordinary work. So our work is this process of stewarding creation, and this creation, this creativity is actually woven all through the biblical story. We are creative human beings, and we are imaging God in the way we do this creative work. God's work reveals who he is, and our work reveals who we are too, what our identity is. God is the only one who works from nothing. In Genesis 1, there's a word that's used of God. I have to say it carefully, Bereshit. Only God works like that. Only he works from nothing. But what I love about what God says is in Genesis 2, when it says that God rested from his work, the word that's used there for work is the same sort of word that we would use for work. So God does some work that is very special, but he also does work like we do as well. And I haven't mentioned Tov, that when God looks at his work, he says Tov, he says it's good, but it means more than that. It means everything is made just right. I wonder if you've ever felt that about the work that you've done, that it's just right. It's fit for purpose. And I've mentioned those Avad and Shema words. So I wonder, we won't actually discuss with each other, but I want you just to think about your work for a moment. How is your work good? What is good about your work? How does your work reflect God's goodness? How does your work serve the common good for everyone? How is your work beautiful? It's another thing I love about God's work. When it says about the fruit, it's not just good to eat, it's not just functional, but actually it's pleasing to the eye. It's beautiful. There's an aesthetic dimension to our work, which is really important. How is your work useful? How is your work dignifying? Do you have a little think about that? And maybe that's something you can discuss at the tables. We're going to have an opportunity to do that shortly. But maybe that's something that you'd want to bring up. But unfortunately, the fact that work is good only lasts for 2 chapters of the Bible. Because by chapter 3, something terrible has happened. The human being has decided that working with God and for God is not enough. They've been tempted to do something different. They've disobeyed God. Immediately we see that work itself is impacted. If you read Genesis 3, there's something really interesting that happens. We have a saying, don't we, that the curse of work. But when you read Genesis 3, you understand that something else is going on here. It's not work itself that is cursed, it's the ground that is cursed. And that is significant because what it means is that work isn't a bad thing. It's the process of working that has been cursed. It's the process of working that is now difficult. Work that was meant to be joyful and fruitful and life-giving has now been impacted. There are consequences for what has happened. There are thorns and thistles that are going to come up and frustrate us. I call it IT. You might have another name for it, and I do apologise to the information technology people in the room. But there are things that just get in our way. We can't do the things that we want to do. We get frustrated in our work. And also in Genesis 3, it talks about painful toil. Isabon. There's going to be work that it's much harder than it needs to be. And in fact, those words, Isabon, also means emotional grief. We will feel emotional grief for the fact that our work is not as good as it should be, that it's more complicated and harder than it should be. So, in terms of our work, it's the process itself that is impacted. It's not work itself. Work will be less productive than we would have hoped for. The weeds will frustrate us. They will distract us from the work that we would love to do. We'll have to work by the sweat of our brow, it says in Genesis 3, and that means it's going to be hard, it's going to be tough. It's going to be harder to work with God as well. Part of the impact of the fall is that there's broken relationship with God. So it's going to be so much harder to work with him. There's also a broken relationship with each other, so working relationships are impacted as well. And there's a broken relationship with creation itself. We see part of this brokenness is that work now becomes a punishment. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but one of the really clear signs of the fall is the fact that work, which was meant to be a good thing, is now used as a punishment. People are enslaved from this time forward. Slavery is a terrible metaphor for how broken work is. And so I love that Christians are involved in breaking those chains of slavery. Work feels fruitless a lot of the time for us. And no matter what our context is. I remember I was teaching a group last week and someone said to me, she said, even in a Christian organisation, she says, what do I do when my work feels so fruitless? Despite all my efforts, I'm not achieving what I would hope to achieve in spite of my prayers, etc. Work often feels fruitless. I wonder if you thought of this, that idols as they existed in the Bible, they were actually made by people working. So if you were a metal worker, you would make a metal idol, or if you were a carpenter, you might make a wooden idol. It's actually you work to make idols in the Old Testament. And of course, God hates idolatry, us worshipping anything else. I think one of the bigger fears in our age is that work itself becomes the idol. We worship work. Work becomes the source of our identity, a source of our self-esteem, the source of our sense of significance, the source of our security. Those are all signs that work has become an idol. So I wonder for you, again, a little time to reflect and something you may discuss at your table shortly. How is your working bad or difficult? Are there ethical issues that you struggle with, that you're finding hard? Are there difficult people that you have to work with? Sometimes the difficult person is myself, I have to acknowledge. Are there broken systems? Are there broken structures? We often think of sin as just a personal thing, an individual thing, but it impacts on structures and systems as well. Is there sin in us that we become more aware of in our work situations? Or are there just toxic cultures that the whole culture of the workplace is actually impacted? I wonder what your experience is. It's easy at this point to be discouraged, but Pastor Bob Thune wrote in the Gospel Coalition, it's important to see both the goodness of work in God's original creation and the struggle of work under the fall. If we only see the good, we'll be frustrated when things don't go as they should. If we only see the bad, we'll have a hard time doing our work to the glory of God. Work is not all good, but it's not all bad. It is part of God's good creation, which has been tainted by the fall, and God is at work to redeem work. So now we come to this idea of work being redeemed, the way work could be. Colossians 1:15-20 is just a magnificent passage to look at in thinking about this. And in that passage, it talks about the fact that Jesus has come to reconcile all things to himself. And 3 times in that passage it says, all things in heaven and all things on earth, all things in heaven and all things on earth, all things in heaven and all things on earth. In other words, everything that we see, the cosmos, is going to be reconciled to God through Jesus by his blood. And that means Jesus is supreme over all things. He is supreme over each of our workplaces. It's a beautiful picture. And Paul tells us that we are part of this message of reconciliation. We are agents of reconciliation in the workplaces, the context in which he has placed us. And in doing that, what we do also is continue Jesus' mission. This is an image that maybe prompts for you that idea. It goes back to Luke 4, that time when Jesus was in the synagogue in Nazareth. And it was his turn to read the scripture for the day, and he stands up and he unrolls the scroll, and it's Isaiah 61, And he reads out about being anointed by the Spirit, and he talks about opening the eyes of the blind and setting the oppressed free. This is Jesus' mission that he has come to earth. And sometimes when we hear those words, sometimes we only think of that in a sort of a spiritual way, that Jesus has come to open the eyes of those who are blind to their sin, and he's come to set those who are oppressed by sin free. But what we see is that Jesus goes on to actually functionally do all those things that he says in that passage. He actually does it. He actively heals people from their blindness. This is a real tangible thing. And Isaiah 61 is a passage that talks about what life is going to be like under the Messiah, and it includes every part of life. It talks about buildings that are built right, that don't fall down. It talks about clothing that's gorgeously made. It talks about tables that groan under the amount of food that's placed on them. This is fruitful work. This is good work. This is work that has been redeemed. And that's part of our role in our workplaces. How can we show people what this is like? So work can be redeemed. Jesus came to reconcile all things to himself, including our workplaces. It is Jesus who is the one who does this redeeming work, but our work can be part of the acts of reconciliation that flow from that. So our work is helping to fulfill Jesus' healing and his freeing mission. How can we do that in our workplaces? What would that look like? Our work gives people a taste of what the kingdom is like. And our work should be done on earth as it is in heaven, those words that Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer. Our work can reveal God, can reveal who God is. And in our work, we can incarnate Jesus. We can be Jesus with skin on. Our work is a way of expressing God's love to the world. So once again, a little moment to reflect on your work. How is your work redeeming? In your work, do you have the opportunity of righting wrongs? Do you have the opportunity of restoring relationships that are broken? Can you bring joy to people through your work? I wonder if you're that joyful person in the workplace who doesn't get down. Is your work part of holding back evil in some way, or can you do that in your capacity or influence in a workplace? Can you promote what is good? I wonder how much redeeming work you can do in your context. But now we move on to the final part. We've hit Revelation. This is eternal work, the way work will be. Revelation 21, 1-4 and 24 is a beautiful picture of what is going to happen. That the new earth will come down. That we will have a city. We've gone from a garden to the city, and a city is a symbol of cultivation, isn't it? It's the work of human beings, is now captured in that idea of the city. And there's going to be no more tears, no more frustration with IT, no more hassles, no more difficult working relationships. There's going to be harmony. And in Revelation 21, 1-4, we also see that God will dwell with his people. We'll be able to work in perfect unity with God again. It's a beautiful picture. And in verse 24, there's this lovely scene where the kings of the earth will bring their splendor to present to God. And I wonder what you imagine that splendor would be. Maybe it's beautiful jewelry or wonderful works of art or something like that. Well, that's all part of our work, isn't it? They're going to bring the results of human work and present it before God. Now, there is some controversy. I don't want to shy away from it. Will the earth be burned? There's some evidence for that in the Bible. Or will the earth be renewed? That can impact somehow on how we see our work and the worth of our work. Is what we do here on earth worth anything if it's all going to be burned up? Or will it be renewed in some way? Two people who have spoken about this and done a lot more research than me, N.T. Wright and Darrell Cosden, have some nice ideas that I think we can bounce off. So N.T. Wright says, as a saved people, we're meant to be a foretaste of what life will look like on new earth. So salvation is about what God is doing through us, not just in and for us. We often think of salvation as something that happens just in us, but maybe salvation is part of what happens through us as well. It's a big thought. And Darrell Cosden, I love his book title. It's The Heavenly Good of Our Earthly Work. That's great. He says, for ordinary Christians, it is largely through our work that we reflect God's image and cooperate with him in bringing humanity and creation to their ultimate maturity and future. I wonder if you've thought about your work that way, as it's part of God bringing it into the new creation. How can your work be a part of that? We need imagination for that, don't we? So, eternal work. We will work in the new creation, but that would be beautiful and glorious work. Our work now echoes into eternity. It's not a verse from the Bible, it's actually a verse from Gladiator, the movie, Russell Crowe, but I really like the concept that the work that we do now actually could echo into eternity. Our work anticipates the new creation. It sort of shows people a little bit, and we can bring it in now. It can be a foretaste of the new creation. It can help people tangibly have a sense of what the new creation might be like. Our work can be part of the design of the new creation. That's something that N.T. Wright talks about, that maybe part of what we do here might be used by God as he designs his new creation for us. In the new creation, we will work with God, and the splendor of our work will be presented before God. So now it's time for you guys to engage with each other on your tables. Here's a couple of questions to make you think about, or it may be that you want to share some of the results of your reflection on the good and the bad and the redeemed work. But I wonder if you could share with each other, has something been prompted as I've been speaking, or some things that you've been thinking about for a while? In what ways do you now see your work as an act of worship? How could your work be an act of worship to God? And what difference could this make to the way you work? So over to you guys. You get about 10 minutes or so to talk on your tables and to share with each other.